Right. Hello and welcome to Offsite Dirt, our construction series, our offsite construction series, I might say, is new with Anthony Gude and cross sections. He's one of our newest contributors. The exciting thing about Anthony is he's using offsite solutions. He's a developer and investor. Welcome, Anthony. We're so glad you are with us.
Audrey, thank you for having me. I'm excited to give some perspective on it.
I think you will. Let's kind of jump in from a developer's perspective. Put your developer hat on right now from all the other jobs that you have. What do you think the trade-offs and benefits should be when contemplating an offsite solution on a construction project?
Well, it's a bit of a multi-part question, I suppose, but we could break it down. I think when there's, from a developer's perspective, when we decided to commit to volumetric modular or other offsite approaches to the industry, we were looking to compress costs and timelines like everyone else. Ultimately, what we found out was that we had to, in order to get and extract the full benefit of doing so, we had to build our business process or execution around that methodology in order to really take the benefits without the drawbacks. And so from a developer's perspective, for us, quantifying those trade-offs early on was super important, and adjusting our schedule, our way of managing our people. We are a self-performing, we are the general contractor on these projects that we're owner developer, and self-perform the horizontal elements. Bringing all of that knowledge together and building out a process to execute was probably one of the largest ways of balancing the trade-offs.
So give our audience a little background of where you started and your company currently to date.
Sure, we're now on our 14th volumetric modular project. We contracted, our sort of flagship project would be 125 units in Ventura County. And currently we've contracted two of the larger well-known firms called Volumetric Building Companies and a Rock Modular to do these 21 buildings all together. Ultimately, this would be the point at which we become a programmatic or develop a programmatic approach to purchasing and developing properties with no compromise on how we intend to execute, which is using offsite construction systems.
So when you're using systems, I love that you're in this space with me, and I've seen you speak at a lot of different conferences, and obviously you have the experience when looking at these approaches. Why did your company feel like you wanted to use offsite as a solution? What was the number one driver for you?
And I think that's a big point of distinguishment, because ultimately I've been in the industry some time, and I had my eye to volumetric modular and specifically built my career around it. But the others that had started the firm, and when we were brought together on this 100-unit plus project to really achieve that scale, they were looking at specific levers to pull. And one of the partners, having come from a tenure at the city of Los Angeles, ultimately was looking at things from a regulatory standpoint. The other partner was in construction, ultimately said, well, if we can self-perform the concrete, then our vertical and horizontal are going to come together really well if we create processes around the commitment to that approach. And then the third layer was that I came in with that specialized experience and wrapped it together to a sort of financial strategy. We said, this is how we're going to present ourselves in the market. So ultimately, the word modular wasn't necessarily the one being used every day. We came from a place of regulatory advantages, cost compression, having a smaller office, do more projects, right? We want to do at least 1 million square feet a year to stay in business as developers. And if we do so, we need to be able to generate pipeline and execute on projects. Are we going to have a 50-person headcount, or can we do it with 15 people, or can we, so ultimately it's very few and far between are the conversations I have with other developers approaching it for the same reasons. But ultimately for us, we wanted a small and nimble team and do a large amount of pipeline and be able to execute on those projects. And it's just not possible, but outside of any sort of sophisticated discussion, to do the same amount of projects with the same amount of people we're doing now. We have maybe a 10-person office, but 3 or 4 decision makers active in the project itself. And we have the capacity and are currently working through a pipeline of RTI and pre-entitlement deals. There would be no way that we'd be able to do that if we were also onboarding subs, if we were also following sort of a decentralized, traditional bid build approach to projects. So I like to say to a lot of people, no, this is happening now, and our commitment is for these reasons. And now I'll tell you about the rest. These are the 3 that are relevant to us and are essential to our model.
I love that you are talking about your model because you guys see it from a different perspective. The conversations that we enter into this type of construction, there's so many different benefits. Lots of people always think the first and foremost thing is the cost, right? And what we're finding out on an investment level, when you're looking at it from that perspective, what was the direct link, or what was the direct benefit from the investment success of this project or any project?
Right. So, it's funny. I always come back to that cost issue being somehow reliant upon a process or your supply chain selection. Really, it's a vendor selection and a business negotiation, and usually more related to scale than anything else. If you're a Lennar of the world, your price per foot is lower than, say, a casual multi-building builder a year, right? I mean, these things seem relatively obvious. And then when you look at a consolidated supply chain, you might have other negotiation levers either in your favor or against your favor. So I almost never refer to costing as a process selection question more than it is a business or negotiation question. And many groups solve for things in different ways. And I can get into specifics about our projects, but ultimately some were even project specific decisions that compress our costs. Shipping, logistics, just like you would do scheduling and logistics on traditional projects, putting multiple vendors on the same project, those answer the cost questions. But to come back to what you were asking, hopefully, is that the decisions related to the financials were enterprise level. If we do more projects with the same headcount as developers, our office staff is a big cost driver. And if we can do this more projects with the people we have, we can treat them better, we can pay them more, and we can deliver on more projects net. The other levers we pulled, and later we might go into the modular finance white paper that I've been working on, the presentation we recently did at MBI. There are other levers that we've pulled, even on the investment management side and asset management side, about how financing modular did not just have the setbacks that it's perceived to have, but also we structured our financing in a way that it benefited both the lender and ourselves and resulted in lesser costs. Nobody talks about it. I'm not really sure why. You always hear it's challenging, it's different, it's harder. I don't know who's selling that ideology, but it's not helpful. For us, we have an accelerated drawdown. We have we built a model specifically around financing modular projects that quantified the impact on IRR of accelerated deployment in cash. We can get into more of the particulars, but ultimately we're able to lower our overall cost of capital and have our supply chain compromise on price because they were getting accelerated payments, which is actually also a pain point in any consolidated supply chain negotiation.
Agreed. So overall, what I'm hearing is that your investment success is directly related to predictability and certainty on how you're doing the deliverables. So let's talk about your communication and streamlining the communication and the approval process. How has that differed with using Offsite as the solution as the developer?
Got it. Well, yeah, coming back to predictability and certainty. and also giving the vendors a sense of certainty on the project, all ties into your financial and your execution model. So there, Martin Fisher, who's at the Industrialized Construction Forum, one time told me I would always hammer him with the different benefits of how we're executing what it was. And one time he just told me, yeah, it makes sense that all of these sort of overlap into a level of predictability that you're trying to create. And then ever since then, I can unstick myself from that work. The ability to understand or have a look around the corner, so to speak, on costs and on timelines is nearly everything. And it's very valuable to have an offsite partner, and probably only with an offsite partner where there's a consolidated supply chain. I keep using that term. That's probably the only time that's possible. And that trickles through our whole financial model. If we have more predictability, then we can create something more programmatic. That in and of itself attracts and lowers our cost of investment. And on the execution side, we can get into processes as developers from the point of acquisition all the way through to lease up, that we know what to expect, versus one piece of our 50 subcontractor base not performing and not having any accountability to the other parts, or substituting vendors or consultants throughout that process. So the idea of having less, cooks in the kitchen is what everyone says. I'll take it. I'll go ahead and take it. We do that on the ownership side, and we pay that forward, because we ultimately, when something comes to us, there's only it's a very clear delineation of when the decisions are made and by whom and for what. And the same thing comes back to us. And so that marriage is essentially what makes our projects profitable. Yeah.
So when we start talking about your projects, and I love the development hat, because from the developer's perspective, I've met developers that walk into an offsite solution coming in with all these creative ideas. Mm-hmm. They don't specifically understand the process or talk to the manufacturer and know what those design assets are and how it fluidly moves through the assembly floor for the factory. So the factory comes in, right? The developer comes in and they're like, we've got this piece of land. We need to maximize it. We know that we need, let's just say 72 units. It's going to be 3 buildings. And we want it to be designed off the charts into this whole new element. And they walk into the manufacturer, and the manufacturer's like, well, that's great. We can do that. But if we design it this way and we can have more efficiencies, we can actually duplicate this process and get the building and the process to you faster. In your experience with your 14 different designs and development, are they all very similar, or have you had the ability to really change one from the other? Is design really the ultimate area in the process that can help things move faster, or is it one of those things that really slows it down? What has been your experience?
So in terms of products, we've been able to deliver something aesthetic and diverse. We haven't had challenges that were unable to be sort of met in that regard. And I could see where, I don't know if it's ultimately a scale question or another management aspect, but if there's potentially an artificial constraint that comes from pre-built processes of a business or partnership, that might be separate than what it means to accelerate design and ultimately iterate enough that when you come to the fabricator, you can develop what you have something both buildable and efficient and appropriate for manufacturing. And so ultimately we came in with a design. Our design team was 10 projects in, and at that point we had sort of dialed it in when we went above 15-20 units already. So I don't have large project experience where we were learning on the job. That happened on a much smaller scale. But ultimately I think there's a meeting of the minds that has to happen probably in design development. And then when you get to the factory, and everyone's model might be slightly different, but we like to get there with CDs appropriately developed, at least past 50%, at very least, to get reasonable bids that make sense. And then ultimately in the future, we're even looking at coming to fabricators with approved sets at the state level and already being familiar with how their connection details work and everything that's specific to their line, having developed those in advance, or having those lessons learned from the prior projects sort of feed into the shop drawing equivalent. But also, I don't know if everyone's the same. We do have our own design team. We haven't delegated design build sort of approach to volumetric modular to the factory. That may change in the future, but ultimately right now we keep those consultants directly hired. And then we also deploy a shop team. So those elements might affect how everyone approaches their fabricator. Still, as early as possible, we just found that we don't sign a production management agreement until much later. So we need an agreement before that to compensate everyone for their time, but ultimately still work on the details of the project even before we're ready to build it. And so
Makes
those are things we're working through.
Right, because as we all learn, it's all about the pre-construction team and putting those pieces together and making sure. It's interesting because a lot of people that are watching this may not know that there's architectural drawings and there's shop drawings, right? So it's kind of cool that you have a team that actually understands both. And I'm just curious, having those plans, has it been easy for you to find factories to execute them, or has that been a challenge finding those factories that can build what you want?
Line availability is probably your only constraint. I mean, just as you would in any other in traditional building, the availability of good teams is always a challenge. But ultimately, if you work past everyone's general availability, again, you start early, and so you'll see when everyone's available and work towards that timeline. But no offsite specific constraint in terms of supply or availability or discussion points. There were early negotiations when we sort of jumped from small projects to larger projects. There was a learning curve on our end on how to negotiate with a fabricator early on. Obviously, it takes longer to commit to a $20 million project than a $5 million project. But ultimately, once we made it past that point, we were able to work. And what we learned was that there has to be a point where there's an assurance to the fabricator that they're investing the time in a way that they're going to either land the contract or that it's a pursuit cost and at the expense of ownership. So I think that was a big lesson learned, in that we'll just approach it from a way of approach the consultancy of the project at a fabrication level earlier in the process, rather than say, okay, well, let's try to figure everything out. So when we sign the production agreement, we then get the voices we get all this other feedback. Ultimately, you need all those parties involved, but you need to know the motivators of all the parties. And so the earlier you can start in pre-con means there's a contract earlier in pre-con, probably separate from your fabrication agreement. Just
Agreed.
getting into the specifics can't really help it.
No, I think it's really good. I think it is good to get into those specifics because people understand, they follow it.
Yeah.
I mean, developers that have been building traditionally have to go through a lot of these different scenarios themselves. It's just that there are shifts into the process, right? And it seems like you have really figured out that process and putting those things together. How do we bring more projects together for the investor and the financing? Like, how do we really marriage that in this type of process?
Oh, thank you for asking. So I think there's an idea that or at least the idea I'm trying to cement, is that there's originators of projects, and ultimately that's going to come from the development community. And so adoption probably hits a bit of is getting its friction from the idea that the developers feel they need to be sold the process. Our industry does a pretty good job of breaking down the benefits, but not necessarily in a way that is easily communicated to the developer and ultimately their client. Right? There's a lot of different types of developers, but let's assume that some of us work for LPs that ultimately are here to not even so much have outsized returns, but consistently and regularly deliver pipeline and deliver reasonable returns. A good product that affects the community in a good way. That's the program that developers are running. And so what I have to do a lot of times when we're translating the sort of industry narrative we're translating it to one centered around, more deployment of capital, managed risks. Why? Well, our enterprise is built in a way to sort of engage the construction community in this way. And a lot of times I try to stay away from the nouns that describe the industry, because ultimately it brings with it whatever that particular investment group or co-developer have done their own research on. And it's kind of all over the map. Right? So we can't just say, oh, we save more time. No, we have to be specific about regulatory parallels. We have to debunk sort of the design limitations and say, no, well, that's just maybe insufficient investment at the design development stage, or maybe these other projects that you may have heard of, maybe they were just talking to fabricators too late in their design. And ultimately, we have to just keep emphasizing that we've built a process. We're not doing one modular project and 15 traditional. We've committed to the entire ecosystem. And so we don't have trouble finding vendors because we've been rooted in this space for a really long time. We have less issues when it comes to communication in our office because we're used to communicating with a central point of contact that has its own level of leverage, like any other self-performing multi-trade super sub. So I try to take those terms and bring them into a space where they're universal to anybody regardless of industry, especially if you have multi-industry LPs. So the best way to succeed in that way, there's the language element, and then there's the fact that we have a built-in captive investor base that's already backing fabricators. Those same groups should at least be promoting, if not also investing in the projects that feed those factories. I'm here to keep the factories busy, all of them, and that requires a certain level of growth in our LP base. So we have probably 50 or 60 sets of eyes watching us do this 100 unit. The momentum from there is that every step along the way, right? You did a 10 unit project, that's wonderful. Let's see 2 of them. We do 2 of them, okay, that's great, but let's see a 20 unit. Oh, good job, that was in Southern California. Why don't you go a bit more north and give us 100 units? And so now that we cross this bridge, I'm not really sure what the next objection is going to be, but here's a 100 unit project, institutional grade, well managed, on time, on budget project using volumetric modular. What would you like to see next, Mr. Investor? But ultimately these are coming from leads that we cultivate over that time, and any support we can get from the community itself, and I say this every fabricator, we can generate more projects and ultimately bring more business in the door. So that's how we do it.
Amen. Amen. So it's relationships. It's really you're building upon building projects. It's all about communication. And I think the most lovely thing about it, Anthony, is you have been in each one of these places, from the developer to being in finance, to being the investor, to having to figure out the process as the general contractor. You've actually have seen the process from beginning to end. And with that, it makes it more comfortable for somebody else to invest in you. And you're also taking care of the investor. Obviously, the relationship and the understanding and the movement of offsite solutions are only becoming greater because you're taking the time in order for them to see it. And then you're always up for the next challenge, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for putting it that way. No, that's very much what the program is. There's, just like there's never going to be a lack of need for architectural engineering, there'll always be a need for those project programmers and developers to sort of champion the best method of delivering. We're the only ones that really get that incentive to have the project deliver a double bottom line, as some would say. And we're here to do that, and committed to industrialized and offsite construction.
Well, there you go, Anthony Gude, our newest series, Cross Sections, on Offsite Dirt and the Offsite Construction series. It makes me happy that we get to hear his voice, his expertise, and the knowledge that we can bring, so other developers and other builders and investors that are interested have now an opportunity to hear it from one of our experts. Thank you so much for being here today on Cross Sections. Anthony, I can't wait for our next show.
Thank you. Talk soon.